What you're about to see is a presentation I gave at Cameron's conference on the existence of God. And I wanted to make this little introduction because the talk that I gave was very advanced. I took my argument to the edge of the field and the edge of my current thinking. And here in this introduction, I just want to give you a big picture about what I'm trying to do in that talk. So the talk is about an ontological argument. An ontological argument is an argument for God based on the concept or the idea of God. The basic idea is that you can just think about God, and by thinking about God, you can deduce that a being that's defined like that would have to exist. Now, you might think, how could this possibly work? How could you possibly derive God's existence just by thinking about the concept of God? Well, the seed idea of the ontological argument is that God's nature is so great, by definition, that it couldn't be contained in just one world. It's so great that it would span all possible worlds. It couldn't just exist in your imagination or in your mind. It would have to also exist in actual reality. The difficulty for philosophers has been to take that seed idea and to develop it into an argument that is rigorous and evidently sound. In fact, for many years, I didn't think anything like this could be done. But as I've been reflecting on some recent developments in the logic of necessity and some developments that are related to the nature of greatness, I've actually spotted a new pathway. And so in this talk, I'm going to talk about that pathway. I'm going to take a journey through those steps to this conclusion that God exists from the concept of God. Now, in the beginning of my talk, I'm concerned with removing some barriers to taking a journey like this in the first place. You might think yourself that this is not the kind of argument that could succeed in principle. Why? Well, because in principle, you can't just think about the concept of something and then deduce that that concept applies to actual reality. I mean, we could think about unicorns, but no matter how much we think about the concept of a unicorn, we can't deduce that there's actually a unicorn. So you might think that in principle, this project cannot succeed. And so what I do in the beginning of the talk is I consider some of the latest and best formulated versions of this kind of objection to the very process of this journey, the very possibility of making an argument like this. And I try to remove those obstacles. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do in this presentation. And then once I've removed those obstacles, it opens up the path to explore. And then I'm going to lay out my exploration. So as I said, this is an advanced presentation. And as you watch this, you might find yourself coming up with new ideas along the way. This is uncharted territory. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
All right, so welcome to the Josh Rasmussen talk. If you don't know who he is, why are you here? I feel like everybody knows.
I came from nothing, I guess.
So he's a professor out at Azusa Pacific University, but he's also just a really good friend of mine. He's on the board of Capturing Christianity. I can't say enough about him. I'm super excited for his talk. I'm going to be sitting down here. Hopefully I don't have to go anywhere because I want to see this really bad. But yeah, let's start.
All right, thank you, Cameron. Yeah, this is so cool to be with you guys. Braxton, in his talk, he talked about the value of inviting God's Spirit to help you with your presentation. So right there, right after he said that, I felt inspired to just invite God's Spirit to help me. And I felt like I had this feeling in my mind, like lean into fun, which is really great because when I was preparing for this talk, I had a picture of two mountains. Am I sounding okay? Because I'm hearing kind of a... Okay. Should I just keep talking and hope that improvements happen? It's already happening. Thank you. So I had a picture of two mountains. One mountain is one that I've climbed up and around many different times about cosmological arguments. I've seen many people venturing through these mountains. It's kind of familiar territory. And then I saw this other steeper, more intimidating, more dangerous mountain that I've never climbed up before. And I've seen very few people climb up, and I've seen nobody at this particular crevice that I was curious to explore. And so I put together this talk around an exploration to get to that mountain and to explore and get to that crevice. So that's what I'm going to share with you guys today. In a way, we're going to go on a journey. It's the journey that I'm on, and I'm just inviting you guys to listen in and be part of it. So this is kind of a journey of my intellectual thinking about a new kind of ontological argument that builds on other ideas. So my purpose is to explore this pathway of reason that goes specifically just from the mere concept of God to the existence of God. Now already, that's supposed to be something you can't do. Any attempt to do that is sophistry. It's like a trick of logic. And I think this is a reason I've not really explored that mountain so much, at least earlier in my career. But in the last 5 years or so, I've been discovering some interesting little features. A few years ago, I sent an email to Alexander Proust, a seed of this idea. And while Alexander Proust is, if Luke Barnes were here, I would say, Alexander Proust is not a Kurt Gödel, but Alex does have 2 PhDs, one in philosophy and one in math. And he said, I think this is excellent. So that gave me a little, this is his response to an email where I lay out the seed of the idea that I'm going to share with you guys. Although I should say last night I was looking for this email and I found another one where I sent him an idea. And his response, the first part of his response was exciting. He said, this is brilliant. But then he had the word but with a series of objections. So something can be excellent and not necessarily successful in the end. So that's why I really want to just go on this journey, think about it, and you guys can think with me, and perhaps you can help me see some new ways of thinking about this. So the roadmap. First, I'm going to look at 3 obstacles to this kind of journey, this journey of arguing from the concept of God to the existence of God. These obstacles keep people off the road, and some of these have kept me off the road. Then I'm going to chart a potential path forward, and this is going to be kind of a windy around all the way to that crevice. And then I'm going to take the results of the argument, and I'm going to put them into a larger framework, which includes things that I've thought more about in this other mountain of exploration. So you'll see how these things can kind of go together. Okay, and just by the way, we're going to go deep. I'm going to just hold nothing back. It's like, am I supposed to make this accessible? I'll do my best. But I decided that it would be the most fun, and I really think the most fun for you, if I just let myself loose and just share with you all the way to the edges of my current thinking on this. Okay, so for the first obstacle that keeps people off of this path is what I'll call the empty concepts problem. This is the problem, this is like the first thing that you might think of, which is that surely there's a difference between having a concept of something and the existence of something, right? So you can have the concept of a unicorn, even if that unicorn does not exist. The mere existence of the concept does not surely entail the existence of the thing the concept is about. The concept could be empty, right? And some of you might think, well, maybe it changes if part of the concept includes necessary existence. You might think that. But no, that's a foolish thought, right? Because you could have the concept of a necessarily existing, actually, no thoughts are foolish. Every thought is a guide to exploring something new. But in this case, you discover it leads into the ditch of falsehood. Because think of the necessarily existing pizza. I have that concept. Do you have that concept? But I don't think that therefore, just by having the concept of a necessarily existing pizza, that there is any such pizza. So that's a problem. So why should we even begin to make an argument from the concept of God? You might like the concept of God. You might think, well, that's a very special concept. Like if we can show that God exists from the concept of God, we would want that to be true. But we can't just believe what we want to be true if we have no reason to think it is, right? Unless Liz Jackson is right. There are exceptions. All right, here's the problem with this first obstacle. The empty concept principle is itself false, and I'm not being overly confident here. I can just demonstrate this for you. So recall the principle. For any concept C, the mere existence of C does not entail the existence of what C is about. If we can think of any counterexample to that principle, and I invite you right now, can you think of a counterexample, just kind of work on that in your mind, then the principle is just not universally true. It might be true in most cases, but if we have any counterexample, then it opens up the door for other counterexamples. So I'm going to give two examples. So first, consider the concept of a concept. Did you think of that? I'm not surprised. C cannot exist unless what it is about exists, right? So therefore C is a counterexample. The concept of being a concept, that concept cannot exist unless what that concept is about, namely a concept, exists. Another concept is the concept of a property. I was trying to give this on Cameron's show like a month ago, but I didn't describe it very well. I don't know if you remember this, Cameron. We talked about this briefly. This is the concept of a property. So the concept of a property cannot exist unless the very concept itself has the property of being a concept. And, well, let me just pause there so you appreciate this, right? So in order for that concept to exist, the thing that it's about, namely a property, also exists because it has to exist in order to be a property of that very concept. Okay, now you're probably thinking like, okay, these are like trivial counterexamples. How does this show that now you can run an ontological argument? It doesn't. All it does is it shows that there's this one barrier to even attempting this pathway up the mountain that we can remove so we're not quite so intimidated. Maybe there are other interesting concepts that by their very existence entail that what they're about also exists. The path is open. Obstacle 2, the empty world's obstacle. So here's the principle, the empty world principle. No concept picks out something that must exist. Okay? Even the necessary existing pizza, the concept is about something that must exist. About it like in its nature. That's what the concept by its nature is about. But that doesn't mean that there actually is a necessarily existing pizza. And so you might have the concept of a necessarily existing God, but it doesn't follow that there is a necessarily existing God. David Hume articulates this when he says that whatever we can conceive as existing, can you conceive that God exists? Well, then you can conceive that God does not exist. Can you conceive that a universe exists? You can conceive that no universe exists. All right. Now here, I'm not going to be quite so bold as just to say, well, that principle is, we can prove that to be false, but rather just to point out that the principle has in itself been shown to be true, and that's actually quite debatable, right? I gave the example of a concept of a property. Some people think that properties have an abstract nature and that these things exist of necessity. There are arguments for that and arguments against that. So that's a matter of debate. A realist perspective, the abstract mathematical landscape necessarily exists, right? So you might think that 2 + 2 = 4, and it equals 4 like every day of the week. And it does so whether you're thinking about it or not. Even if all human beings stopped thinking about 2 + 2 = 4, it would still actually equal 4. And you might think that the actual equaling 4 is a matter of the nature of the mathematical landscape. It just exists. And then philosophers debate, well, what kind of thing could this be? Does it exist in God's mind? Does it exist in the fabric of nature? What is this? That's a matter of debate. And so until we resolve that debate, I don't yet have a barrier to this pathway for having concepts about necessary things. So I mentioned the Platonism. This is the idea that there are these abstract things that necessarily exist, even if they're not instantiated in the world. The empty world principle itself could only be necessarily true if it necessarily exists, because it has to be there to be true. And if it's necessarily true, it's got to necessarily be there. Now, this assumes a kind of Platonist framework. There's also an argument that I give for this that doesn't assume a Platonist framework in this article called From Necessary Truth to Necessary Existence. I've actually been rethinking some of the steps of that argument, so I'm not even as sure about this possibility here, but again, it just opens up the pathway. Second, a case can be made for the necessary existence of a fundamental reality. And this is something this is the mountain that I was referring to, that first mountain that's more familiar to me. A lot of my work has been on arguing for this. I have a book called Necessary Existence, where Alex Proust and I make many different arguments for a necessary fundamental reality, and I think that at least one of those arguments is a sound argument. So I do think that there are necessary things. Any merely contingent, non-necessary realm, you might think, would plausibly depend on some prior condition, and the only way to be a prior condition of non-necessary things is to be necessary, to be something else. And then finally, and this is maybe the most fundamental point here, is that the empty world principle has just not been established by any light of reason that I've seen to be true. And so for me, this is enough for the door now to stay open, that maybe there is a way to argue that there's a necessary reality from the concept of something, maybe a certain special concept. Okay, third limit. This is one that I get a lot in different contexts. I've gotten this a lot kind of in sort of popular interactions with people on Facebook and on YouTube. People suggest to me that reason doesn't have the power to reveal that there must be something. So like maybe there's controversy, but we can't really resolve the controversy using reason alone. Reason cannot by itself illuminate whether an empty world is possible. So here's an argument from consistency. If reason could illuminate whether an empty world is possible, okay, then there is nothing. In other words, if reason could show us that there can't be an empty world because there's this necessarily existing thing, empty world just cannot be, that means that if it's by reason, there has to be some contradiction in the notion of an empty world, which means that the proposition there is nothing would entail a contradiction. But there's this existential premise, which I take from the Oxford philosopher Richard Swinburne, who has this premise that says that no existential proposition, no negative existential, this is a proposition about what does not exist, like there's nothing that exists, entails a positive existential. So there's no way to derive a contradiction in principle just using logic and reason from denying things. Like if you guys don't exist, that doesn't entail that squirrels do exist, right? I mean, you could deny your existence and the existence of squirrels. You could just subtract everything out. So for example, there are no unicorns does not entail that there are unicorns. Similarly, there is no perfect being doesn't entail that there is a perfect being. So it's like game over, really. I mean, how could you use reason to show that there's a perfect being if there's no contradiction in saying there is no perfect being? So we really shouldn't try to prove that there is. So therefore, reason cannot illuminate whether an empty world is possible. Okay, but now this time I'm ready to be bolder again. The existential premise is false, and I think I can demonstrate this for you. Recall the existential premise. No negative existential entails a positive existential. Well, consider this negative existential. There are no truths. That entails that the proposition that there are no truths entails this other proposition. The proposition that there are no truths is true. These are linked by entailment. So if you have these two propositions, you can see by the light of reason that if the one is true, that there are no truths, then the other is true, that there are no truths is true. That's true. And Tarski has this schema P if and only if P is true. As long as you can plug in something for P there, I think you can plug something in on both sides. As long as the propositions on both sides exist, I think that link holds. Therefore, there are no truths entails that there is a truth, and there's the contradiction that was supposedly impossible. So again, just like with the empty concept principle, I've not shown that now we can therefore argue that God exists through reason or just by the concept of God. All I've done is removed one specific barrier to, in principle, making that pathway. And the barrier was that it's impossible, in principle, to deduce a contradiction from a negative existential. That's false. I just did it. And it's actually kind of interesting. I presented a version of this to Richard Swinburne at a philosophy conference. And his response was then to modify his argument to focus not just on anything, but on particular things like concrete substances. And so then that invites the next part of the conversation to see if we can continue from there. So I'd say the path is open. Here's 5 ideas. I'm going to just point to these, and then I'm going to pursue the most dangerous one with you. First, there's the familiar argument. I'm sure this is familiar to many of you, this sort of Plantingian argument from the possibility of a maximally great being. And then you can argue that a maximally great being is so great, it would span all possible worlds if it spanned any possible world. So if it's even possible that it exists, it actually exists. The biggest difficulty with this argument is there's this problem of reverse arguments, where you argue, well, maybe possibly there is no maximally great being, and then from there you can deduce that, well, if it were possible, then there would be one, so it's possible that there's not, so there is none. And this has led to recent developments in the philosophy of religion focusing on symmetry breakers. And I know that Cameron Bertuzzi had a guest on his show, Joe Schmid and Alex O'Connor, and they talked about a recent development in the field generated really in conversations with Capturing Christianity and his own mind, thinking that through. And so there's interesting work there at the edge of the field. There's an argument from the existence of abstracta. There's a kind of conceptualist argument. Non-theist philosopher Quentin Smith actually develops a version of this argument, and there's more recent developments of this that are worth considering. There's an argument that I've been thinking about kind of recently as I've been working on the nature of consciousness and the origin of thoughts and feelings in our minds. You might argue that in order for there to be the concept of God, there has to at least be a concept of something. But that in order for there to be any concept of anything, the bottom of reality has to be mental in some way, because you don't get concepts purely from mindless noise. So there's a pathway there that might be worth exploring. There's a pathway that I've worked out toward the end of my book, How Reason Can Lead to God, from the explicability of limits or imperfect things. And then the bolded one is the most dangerous one. This is the one that goes purely from the concept of God and thinks about the properties of what God would be, thinks about the positivity of the perfect nature of God, and then just tries to derive, just spinning those webs of reason, and deduces something concrete in the actual world. This is the pathway, the positivity of perfection that might remind you of Anselm's ontological argument. And so I'm going to have a look at his and see how we can develop it. So an early form of this idea sprouted into Anselm's argument from greatness. Here's one sort of rough way of putting it. God either exists only in one's mind or also in reality. If God only exists in one's mind, then God is not the greatest conceivable, because the greatest conceivable would exist not just in your mind, but also in reality. But God, by definition, the very concept of God, includes being the greatest conceivable. Therefore, God exists in reality also. Now, this is a very interesting argument, because most philosophers have thought that, whether they believe in God or not, most philosophers have thought this argument fails. But the trick is to figure out, why exactly does it fail? And there's been a lot of philosophy, and I think a lot of insights that have been generated from really taking seriously the argument and looking at how do we articulate the argument? How do we see where it goes wrong? And I think in general, if you experience a kind of a tension in an idea, like you see an argument for something, you think that can't be right. If you run from that tension, you say, well, it can't be right, so we're not going to investigate that. That's fine, you can do that. But if you actually run into the tension, that's where you can mine wisdom, you can mine understanding. And maybe what you get is not that the argument was sound, but you just get a lot more understanding of the mechanics of things that you can apply elsewhere. So here's the standard analysis. This is what was given to me in graduate school, and this seemed right to me at the time. Actually still seems about right. When we make the argument from greatness precise, we can see that it is either invalid or question-begging. Because recall the first premise, God either exists only in your mind or also in reality. The term God here, it's kind of ambiguous. What are we picking out? Are we picking out the concept of God? Is that what we're talking about? Or are we talking about God? Which is it? Are we talking about the idea of God? Let's get clear about this. So we work this out in first order predicate logic, and what we discover is that, if God picks out the concept of God, then the argument only shows us that the concept of God exists. So, wow, the concept of God exists, that's awesome, but that's not the goal of the argument. The goal was to show that God exists. So let's say that God in that first premise picks out God. Well, then the first premise is question-begging. That is to say, it's assuming the very thing. It tucks in the very thing we're trying to show. You could never believe that first premise, that God refers to anything unless the very thing we're arguing for already exists. And so therefore the argument is not something that you're going to believe unless you already believe in God. It's not going to help you. There's different ways you might develop the Anselm's argument. There's this book I reviewed called Anselm's Other Argument. And some philosophers have argued maybe Anselm was really having an argument that the seed of which turns into Plantinga's modal ontological argument that we looked at. But another way is this Gödelian line that I'm going to unpack a little bit for you. The idea here is that when you look through the concept of God, you actually see in that concept, concepts encode natures. And so you'll see a perfect nature. Now you can start thinking about the nature of the nature, the properties of the property of perfection. We can inspect the properties of this nature, and what we see is that it's a very positive thing. It's like you think about the perfection, you think about knowledge, power, goodness. They all seem to have something in common. I sometimes like to use this example. Like if I'm praising my wife, Rachel, and I'm saying, you're so awesome, you're so beautiful, you've got so much knowledge, so much power, you're so, wicked all the time. It's like somehow that last thing that I said it wasn't really consistent with the other things, because to be positive is to say only good things. You might think that when you inspect the nature of God, those properties, they all have something in common, they're all positive. What Gödel does is he identifies a link between the positivity of a nature and its exemplification. And if we can do that, then maybe we can show that the very nature testifies to its own instantiation and reality or exemplification. But that's the big question, okay? So I'm not saying we've got an argument. I'm saying, here's a question, actually. So I'm exploring that. I'm maybe halfway up this mountain, and there's this interesting ledge over here, and let's see if we can get up on there. Is it possible to derive the exemplification of perfection from its positivity? One morning, I get my thoughts in the morning. I just go to sleep. I'm thinking about something. I have questions. I wake up. I've got ideas about anything, philosophy, relationships, how I could have done something different, how I could do something better. So one morning I woke up with the following thought. I don't know how this happened. It just came into my mind. The light came onto my face, and I just opened my eyes. No positive property entails a negative property. Now let me just say, I hadn't read Gödel. I didn't know his argument at this point. So later I discovered the link between this thought and what Gödel does. But I had this thought, and this led me to think about the following entailment line, which is a kind of Gödelian ontological argument. There's different ways of formulating this. But we start with the thought that I woke up with. No positive property entails a negative property. Absolute perfection would be like the nature of God. So if you have the concept of God, that concept is a window into a nature. And you can inspect the properties of that nature, and you can see, it's positive. It's not negative. Now, that doesn't yet tell us whether it's real, right? Because there could be a nature that's positive, it may not be real, but it's just a positive nature. You maybe want it to be real because it's so positive. Well, it follows from these premises that absolute perfection does not entail a negative property. Impossible properties entail every possible property for technical reasons. Sometimes we call this explosion. One kind of picturesque way to sort of just think about this briefly without going into all the details is to just think about these possible worlds or possible ways reality might be. And so if P entails Q, that means that every possible world in which P is instantiated, Q is also instantiated. If there's not an entailment, then that means there's got to be some possible world where P is instantiated, but it's not sufficient for Q to be instantiated. There's got to be at least some possible world where P is instantiated without Q. All right? Well, so what that means is that if there's no possible world where P is instantiated, well, then P would have to go ahead and entail all the properties, including Q. Because again, if it doesn't have that entailment, then there's a possible world where P is actually instantiated and doesn't entail Q. Okay, so I'm just going to continue along here and just point out that from these premises, you do get something kind of interesting, which is that absolute perfection is actually possibly instantiated now. This might remind you of the Plantinga's modal cosmological argument, where we had that symmetry problem. Why think that God's existence is possible, rather than it's possible that God does not exist? Well, here's a reason. Here's a reason, thinking about the concept of God, that allows you to see that, well, from the concept of God, the concept is a window into a nature. That nature seems to be positive by reason, by the light of reason. And then by these deductions, you get that, therefore, perfection is possibly instantiated. So now you run kind of the rest of the modal argument. A perfect being, you might think by definition, is too great to not exist if it could possibly exist. It would span all the possible worlds if it spanned any possible worlds. And there's a way to make this very precise and very technical. On my website, I actually have a link where I deduce these things in contemporary technical terms, so that it sort of alleviates people so they can really see that clearly.
Justin.
How much time do we have?
Plenty. Okay. I wanted to do kind of what we do when we do our talks and stuff.
Yeah.
How does 5 follow from 1 through 4? Can you just go through that one more time?
Yeah. Okay. So no positive property entails a negative one. Absolute perfection is positive. So therefore, absolute perfection, because it's positive, it can't entail a negative one. But impossible properties entail every property. Yeah, thanks, Cameron. What I really want to make explicit, it entails every property, including every negative property. Okay? But since absolute perfection doesn't entail a negative property, therefore now it follows that absolute perfection has to be possible, right? If it's impossible, it entails all the properties, including the negative ones. Thank you, Cameron. That was helpful here. Does that make sense, you guys? Clear with that? Okay. So necessary perfection is possible. Absolute perfection includes all atomic positive properties, knowledge, power, goodness, or whatever they are. And so this is a reason to think that a perfect being would have necessary existence. And so anything that would have necessary existence, if that thing actually possibly exists, there's actually a possible world where it exists, then since it has necessary existence in that world, it follows that in that world, it spans all the other possible worlds, including the actual world. And so this is how you can deduce the actual existence of a perfect being from its possible existence, given the idea that a perfect being would include necessary perfect existence. Now notice, this is very different than what we were doing before when we thought about the concept of the necessary pizza. Because here we had an independent argument from entailment based on the positivity of the nature of perfection to deduce its possible instantiation. Then from there, we run the argument to this conclusion. Okay, now, before you think that I'm too excited about this argument, I have a worry. So here's a parody that I was kind of wondering about. And this worry is a prequel to the email that I sent to Alexander Proust, was actually a response to this worry. So let's say you say, no shape entails a sensation. I mean, doesn't that seem kind of intuitive? Like, why would shapes entail sensations? You could think about the philosophy of mind, and you could maybe debate that, but you might think that's right. A maximally sided shape is a shape. It's maybe an incoherent shape, but it is a shape. Because for every sided shape, it's not maximal. You could always have more sides. Impossible properties entail everything, including every sensation. And so now it follows by the same reasoning. I'm just using parallel reasoning that a maximally sided shape is possible. The impossible entails everything, but a maximally sided shape does not entail a sensation. Therefore, a maximally sided shape is possible. But that can't be right. I mean, maximally sided shape is not possible. So sad. I mean, the argument just goes wrong. I mean, why would I wake up in the morning with this thought and the light shining on my face? It's almost like it's like divine inspiration. Like, no positive property entails a negative property. That must mean something, but I guess not. Problem of evil. It's a pointless thought that occurred to me. See, here's, I think, the problem with both arguments. So I'm diagnosing the problem with both both the argument from entailment that I gave and then the parallel argument. I think it's the problem with the difference between not seeing an entailment and seeing a non-entailment. You always have to be careful about like not confusing those. Like in the problem of evil, like there's a difference between like not seeing why God might allow suffering and then seeing that God has no reason for allowing suffering. Like that inference is a substantial inference, and they don't just automatically follow. So, maybe what's going on here is that we just don't see how shapes could entail sensations, but that's because we don't really see into the nature of the impossibility of certain shapes. But once we could see that, then we could see that there actually is this entailment by this technical explosion reason. So we may not see an entailment between a shape and a sensation, but not seeing that entailment is not the same as seeing a non-entailment. So we got to get that clear. See, this is the kind of like progress you can make. Like whatever happens with the argument, at least now we're learning these lessons, right? Like the difference between seeing not seeing, that makes us more powerful. So we gain powers as we work on these puzzles. To see that no entailment holds requires that we see the non-entailment between every shape and every sensation. That's not what we're doing. So the same problem applies to the Gödelian argument that I gave. Recall the premise. And I've seen different forms of this argument, including in the literature. And it just seems to me that they all fall prey to this exact same worry that I have. I'm not saying that the authors don't have a response that might work in their own minds, but like for me, I just continue to have this worry. Like I'm not sure I'm really seeing the non-entailment. So, do we see the non-entailment between the positive and the negative? I woke up with that thought, no positive property entails a negative one, but do I really see that that's true? Or do we just fail to see the entailment? For all we see, perhaps positivity does entail negativity. Maybe. Okay, now we're getting like to the very top crevice here. Here's the way forward that has occurred to me. This is the secret thing that I've not revealed to anybody else except for Alexander Proust. And that was in a seed form, so like now it's further developed, just for you guys. There is a difference between a maximal shape and a perfect nature. A maximal shape has no intrinsic property that sheds light on whether or not it might entail via explosion a sensation. By contrast, a perfect nature seems to have a purely positive aspect. And the question is, can you see something by the light of this positivity that would inform us about the entailment? All right, so that's, we're not in the dark about the concept, about the contents of a perfect nature. We can actually look through the window of that. This takes work. You have to actually entertain the concept of a perfect being, look through the window of that concept, see that perfect nature, inspect its aspects, inspect its properties. So perfect nature includes positive properties like perfect knowledge, perfect goodness, supreme power, maximally robust existence. These are all intrinsically positive. Could this purely positive aspect shed light on whether a perfect nature entails a negative property? So here's my argument. The argument from the positivity of perfection. It's like God is too great not to exist. That's kind of the tagline for this. A perfect nature is purely positive. No purely positive nature has a negative property. You see this by inspecting the nature itself. Inspect it, see if this is right. If it's purely positive, then by its very nature, it doesn't have a negative property. The property of entailing a negative property, that's negative. Okay? That detracts from the nature. It's like a defect if it entails a negative property. This is conceptually tricky because we're talking not just about properties, but properties of properties. So it's kind of a second order logic in play here. So now it follows that a perfect nature, call that absolute perfection, does not entail a negative property. Okay, do you see how that follows? I mean, the conclusion was the thought that I woke up with. But now I have this independent argument for it. Look through the window of the concept of perfection, see the nature, inspect its positivity. No purely positive nature has a negative property. The property of entailing a negative property is negative, so it can't have that property. I can't have the property of entailing a negative property, so therefore it doesn't entail a negative property. if it actually entailed a negative property, then we could say it has the property of entailing a negative property. You guys with me? Yeah. Okay. So this is deep. I mean, we've gone past undergrad, grad, and now we're deep into, this is like what I would give at a professional conference. I feel like if you're following along, and I feel that you are, and I just feel like this is the right audience I can do this, but to whatever degree that you are following along, I think you should feel quite good about that. Okay, so putting the argument together, the new ontological argument from perfection. There is a concept of a perfect being. That's the most substantial premise in the argument now. I don't know if that's true or not, but we can now move from this concept to the nature. So if there's a concept of a perfect being, then there is the property, we'll call it P, of being absolutely perfect. This property, you might think, constitutes the shareable, or what philosophers sometimes call the narrow content of a concept. In this case, the concept of a perfect being. So like if I have a concept of a unicorn, then the content of that concept might be the nature or the property being a unicorn. The property is not instantiated, but the property does exist in that concept. And then you can share that concept by having the same property in your concept of a unicorn. Same thing for a perfect being. So now we have the results of the previous argument. P does not entail anything negative by the argument from the positivity of perfection. Therefore, P is possible by the argument from explosion that we saw. An instance of P, which would be a perfect being, would span all worlds, if any, which we saw, and therefore a perfect being exists in the actual world, because this is one of the possible worlds. So this is an outline that summarizes all the concepts that we've covered to get to this crevice, and has a pretty interesting conclusion, starting with the concept of a perfect being. Okay, we have the island parity. There's a concept of a perfect island. If there's a concept of a perfect being, then there is the property S of being a perfect island. S does not entail anything negative by the argument from the positivity of perfect islands. Therefore, S is possible. Now, I'm going to do this quickly, for sake of time, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that this parity actually has an important difference. So the parity is saying that an instance of S, the perfect island, spans all worlds, if any. Therefore, a perfect island actually exists in our world. That conclusion seems like too much. Doesn't seem like this argument could be successful, but it's parallel to the argument that I gave. So unless there's some relevant difference between the arguments, there's got to be something wrong with both arguments. Unless there is this perfect island, right? So here's my reply to the parity. It's actually not a parallel argument, and actually seeing the difference it's very helpful, I think very satisfying to see what it is about perfection that's relevantly different from every other conceivable nature. So perfection is, by definition, the purely positive nature. So a perfect island was supposed to be purely positive, and no purely positive nature has a negative property. The property of entailing a negative property is negative, therefore a perfect island nature does not entail a negative property. But the problem, though, is that a perfect island nature is not purely positive. I mean, think about it. Every conceivable island is fundamentally limited in some way. It's got some limit in power, some limit in knowledge, some limit in goodness. I mean, if it were perfect, then, it would just be a name for God. I mean, that's what we would mean by God. So it looks like the parity fails. The only nature that would be purely positive is a perfect nature, the nature of a perfect being. All right, so this is starting to be maybe kind of exciting. Maybe this most dangerous mountain that you're not supposed to get to the top of, deriving God's existence from the concept of God, maybe we're getting there. Maybe there's something here. Here's a remaining worry. It's a question. So remember that distinction between seeing that there's not an entailment versus not seeing that there is an entailment. There's a similar question here when you think about seeing that perfection has no negative property versus just not seeing that it has a negative property. Maybe there's some negative property hiding inside the concept of a perfect being. Now, at this point on this journey, you might be sort of curious to see what I might say about this worry. This is at the edge of my thinking. This is an open question for me. So I don't have a response. I mean, the only thing that I can say is that I have a question. I'm not convinced that a perfect nature would or could possibly have any negative aspect. Perhaps sort of by definition, perfect nature just could not have a negative aspect. Look through the concept of a perfect being, see the nature, inspect it, and see that it doesn't have negativity. But I think that's an appropriate place to sort of leave the development of this argument for further research. And what I want to do, I know I'm getting toward the end of time here, I want to show how you can maybe integrate this argument with a wider set of considerations. So a spider web has many lines that are reinforcing. A web of interlocking ideas can reinforce each other. The positivity of perfection unlocks a solution to an independent problem of inexplicable limits. And this is something that I've worked on quite a bit. I'm going to just briefly lay this out. So the problem of inexplicable limits, or the inexplicable existence, it also applies to limits, is based on this question: what explains the difference between the explicable parts of reality, and then, like, if this were reality as a whole, there's nothing beyond reality as a whole that could explain it. And so somehow reality as a whole has no outside external explanation. But if everything else has an outside external explanation, then it seems like there has to be some relevant difference. I mean, reality as a whole probably is not a giant Lego, because if it were, then it would sort of demand a further explanation, but it couldn't have one since it's reality as a whole, so there's got to be something else. So I say that reality has some foundational element that has no further explanation, but how can that be? What could be foundational? Well, here you have a solution to this problem to explain this difference between the explained and the unexplained foundation in terms of the perfect nature, because that's the right kind of nature to be ultimate and foundational. So maybe the window of the concept of a perfect being helps you to see that a perfect nature would be purely positive, and then for technical reasons would have to be instantiated in the world. But also, this provides a solution to an outstanding philosophical puzzle about how anything at all could exist. If the foundation of reality is perfect, that would explain then how everything else can exist and why it doesn't have a further explanation, because by the light of its positive perfection, it couldn't have a further explanation. If it did, it wouldn't be perfect. So all imperfect things, by contrast, can, consistent with reason, have a further explanation. Perfection is relevantly different. That's the key. It's a relevantly different nature. So I'm going to close by giving you a model that puts everything together, a model of a perfect foundation, just a few theses, a few ad hoc theses here. The fundamental layer of reality, it has some nature, but it's not a turtle, because turtles are not relevantly different from explained caused things. It's not blue, it's at least not fundamentally blue, because again, being blue is not relevantly different from explained caused things, and the foundation is uncaused and has no external explanation. I think it has no arbitrary limits or qualities for the same reason. Arbitrary limits and arbitrary qualities are not relevantly different from each other to account for how it can be foundational. It is instead purely good, unrestricted in power, and the foundation of all that we see. In other words, it has a perfect nature. That's my model. It contains the necessary pillars of reason, the logical landscape. It anchors every dimension of reality, the moral dimension, the mental dimension, even the material world. It provides the deepest, most ultimate possible, even conceivable explanation of everything that you could even think of, which is, I think, pretty interesting. And in its substance, all things exist, live and move and have their being. Three advantages, this is the final part here, is three advantages of this model, is first, it solves that problem of inexplicable existence. It explains how there could be a reality that has no further explanation, because it's the greatest kind of reality, and so couldn't, by virtue of its greatness, have a further explanation. It has the widest predictive success in the most parsimonious way. Of all the theories of reality, all the grand scale theories of reality that I have considered, I have never seen even a candidate for a simpler theory with as much predictive success as the perfect foundation theory. Drawing that out would involve another talk, but you can see how it would predict all sorts of things we observe, such as, it's got perfections, it's got perfect powers to produce all sorts of interesting things. Consciousness, beings that can ask questions, beings that can wonder whether God exists. These are all the kinds of things that would be made possible by this perfect foundation. And it fits perfectly with this new ontological argument from perfection, which kind of gives me a little added reason to think that this other argument has something independently of sort of the intrinsic evidentness of the premises. It gives me more optimism that these can go together. Thank you guys for your time.
So I have my own objection to your argument.
Okay.
I'm not going to give it right now.
Yeah, okay.
Because we can talk later.
Yeah, we can talk.
We can talk later.
Yeah.
But if you guys have questions or objections, so here's the deal. We're right at the time where we need to take a break. So if you would like to take your break and go get coffee, go to the bathroom, feel free to do that. Are you cool with doing questions?
Yeah,
Stick around for another 10 minutes to do that? Okay. So who has a question? I saw Eric first.
So unless I'm missing something, it seems like the argument takes for granted or assumes that negative properties are possessed, but there's
Are possessed?
Yeah, unless, like I said, unless I misunderstood or missing something. So like I know in philosophical foundations, Moreland and Craig argue that substances don't possess negative properties because they don't exist. It's better to say
they lack them.
They fail, right? They failed to have, but they don't. I don't possess the property of being a not bear.
Yeah.
I just failed to have the. So, am I missing something,
No,
or are you
that's
using
nice.
it differently?
So we can translate this in terms of entailing the lack of a positive property. I remember reading there, and I think they talk about reality. There's lacks of unicorns. That's different than the having of a negative.
Right.
So we could perhaps translate this. So I think that the argument's actually flexible to be translated in terms of lacks.
So you're not saying that something's possessing a negative property?
You wouldn't have to say that. You could, but you wouldn't have to. You could say instead it just doesn't possess a positive property. Yeah, thank you.
How flexible is this argument with the concept of a concept? Do I have to say this concept is like a Platonic thing, or can I be a nominalist and think that, like, what if I was like really reductive? I might just think, a concept is just something possibly thought by a person.
As far as I can tell, unless you're an eliminativist, well, no, actually, if you're an eliminativist, then you eliminate concepts. So, the counterexample basically just requires that there are concepts, and we can analyze them nominalistically as concrete parts of the brain. They could be abstract things. We could think about it in an Aristotelian way, where they're abstract, but they're also instantiated. Or we could even just think about it in a Platonic way. So I think it really is flexible across those models. Yeah. Good question. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question on negative concepts. I don't think I have a good grasp on it. So if a being is all-powerful, does that not entail that he can't create a being that's more powerful than him? Is that an example of like a positive property that entails a negative property?
So being unable to create a more powerful being, and that inability to create a more powerful being, you might think of that as a negative property. Is that the question? Is that the idea? Yeah, so I mean, I would say that at the very least, possible powers would be positive. An impossible power, there's something about the impossibility of the power, especially if it contradicts principles of reason. It seems to me that it would inherit a certain kind of negativity in virtue of that contradiction, in virtue of that negativity. Well, this is a very tricky topic because Jeff speaks in his book on the greatest possible being. He goes into quite a bit of depth, and I have a review. He goes into a lot of depth on this very question about powers and impossible powers and how to think about them. And I have a review of that book where I actually think that he makes some really good points about the problems there. So I don't really have an easy answer to your question. It's a really tough question. But I do think there's a kind of negativity that comes from the contradiction of reason. So like the very impossibility sort of brings about a negativity. So that it's not positive in the axiological sense, in the sense of value. It might have a negative form, like, not. The word not is negative, right? But that's not what I mean here. Yeah. Thank you.
Great talk. It seemed like in a nutshell, you just provided like the perfect symmetry breaker right there, or symmetry breaker between, you kind of postulate this idea of perfection. Why should we choose between competing hypotheses? And this idea of perfection kind of gets us there. My question is, later on, that last consideration you left open, didn't we already kind of rule that out? Like you kind of reopen the idea, can we kind of examine this concept and see if there is any kind of negative property within it? But didn't we kind of already rule that out earlier, just by definition of this concept of perfection that you're offering?
Yeah, it might be that that's right. Like by definition. So here's where I'm really at. This is really the edge of my thought about this. Is you can rule out my final worry just by definition. You can just like by definition, a perfect nature is purely positive. That's what I mean by it. Then my worry is that, well, do I actually have a concept of a perfect being through which I can see a perfect nature? Like maybe there is no nature that's purely positive. That's why I think it really does then now come down to that first premise. Do you have actually a concept of a perfect being? Do you actually have that concept? And then my analysis of the concept is that it would have that nature as its content. And if that's right, then I think the argument does go through at that point. Yeah. But I want to be very careful about just saying, well, by definition, because then my worry is it's like moving the bump under the carpet. It's like we've made this premise very clear just by stipulating the definition, but maybe we've just kind of moved the substance over here. Like, do we actually have that concept? Do we actually see that nature? Yeah.
All right, let's do one more question on this side.
Hey, Dr. Rasmussen, thank you for your talk. I really appreciated it. I have a thought from your favorite agnostic friend. He says, suppose that we grant that it is constitutive of a perfection or positive property, that it only entails other perfections or positive properties. Then the claim that being supreme or being God or being godlike or being perfect by the atheist's lights are absolutely not perfections or positive properties. For we know from the modal ontological argument that atheists are committed to God's being impossible, and consequently the impossibility of the properties being God, being supreme, being godlike, being perfect, and so on. By the principle of explosion, impossible properties entail everything, including negative properties and imperfections, and/or imperfections. And hence, impossible properties are not positive properties and/or imperfections, and vice versa. But then no one who isn't already a theist would ever grant that being supreme, being God, etc., are positive properties and/or perfections. The argument becomes dialectically toothless. I would love to hear your response to that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, I mean, my first thought is like that line of thought might actually verify that at least the conclusion follows from the premises, right? So you can like work backwards. You could say, well, we think the conclusion is false and couldn't be true. And so therefore we work backwards and say, well, then these things can't be positive, right? These properties can't be positive. I think all the substance then is in that first premise, together with the analysis of the concept as picking out a nature that you can see. You like have to do the work. Like, can you just see that knowledge is positive? Can you just see it? You make the deductions. Now, there might be, I have a suspicion there's more tucked into that I would want to like sit down and read and analyze that, knowing my favorite agnostic friend, Joe Schmid, whom I already mentioned in this talk. And so I would really like to give that more careful reflection. But I do think dialectically, my claim is never that you are irrational, right? Like if you don't accept all the premises. So you might rationally motivate reasons to doubt the conclusion, which then can give you reasons to doubt that these properties are positive, But you might also have independent reasons just by thinking about those properties and just bringing them to your mind and just like, oh, they are positive. That's why you have to do the work in your own mind to just test that out and see, is that positive? Yeah. Thank you, Joe.
All right, I think that's going to do it for us. Thank you again, Josh. That was awesome.
So you're not going to give me your objection?
Do you want my objection?
Well, you're just going to lay out for the audience that you have this secret objection.
I have this secret objection.
It destroys the argument.
It destroys it.
And I can't even answer it.
It doesn't destroy it.
Except all I can say is that I know that it's not a sound objection.
All right, so let me lay it on you then. Can we go back to the slide? I don't know if we can pull it up. It's the slide about the explosion principle.
Okay. Yeah.
That's basically my worry, because it's very technical.
Yeah.
Like maybe there's some wiggle room there.
I actually think, I think that your worry there might precisely relate to, I was going to say it might relate to my initial worry that the properties aren't related in the right way. That's why we need an extra support. But what you're pointing out is that the actual technical deduction can be avoided in other ways. And that is, I think, an open research project, so that can you run the same argument, right? So Gödel has different forms of the argument, and they don't all rely on the same technical deductions. Yeah. So I haven't refuted your objection like I said that I would. Instead, I'm pointing to more research projects for everybody else.
All right, there you go.
Thank you.
And we'll talk more about it later.
Yeah.
Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?